Thank you all for being here today. I'm Chris Armatas, a research social scientist with the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute. I'm excited to present a public engagement approach, which can practically be implemented within the context of broad-scale planning efforts. And for today's presentation, I'm going to focus on an application with the Flathead Wild and Scenic River System in Montana. And just as a quick overview, I'd like to acknowledge the research team, which was formed through a research joint venture between the Leopold Institute and the University of Montana. And then I want to send a big thanks to the management team and planning team for their involvement and collaboration. And this was at the forest and district level as well as at the regional level. And so, among others, I want to thank Coulter Pence, Chris Prue, and Jimmy Gaudry. And trying to develop, something that is of use to managers was a big part of this work. And so the involvement of those folks actually doing the planning on the ground was really integral. And also, finally, thanks to the River Management Society for putting on the symposium. And thanks to the primary funding source for this research, the Western Wildlands Environmental Threat Assessment Center. And for this presentation, following a short background, I'm aiming to really accomplish three things. First, I describe the public engagement approach that is fully outlined in the general technical report pictured here. And this is where I spend most of my time, as this presentation is really focused on conveying this approach as something that could be adopted in practice in the field. And then second, I'll provide some select results from the Flathead application and then close with some discussion of how this social science protocol could actually support management and planning on the ground. And I want to start with the problem that very broadly this approach can support. And that problem is laid out in the 2012 planning rule is the need for planning and management of our national forests to address ecological, sociocultural, and economic sustainability. And while this is in the context of kind of forest planning more broadly, when you nail it down to something a bit more specific, like protecting and enhancing ORVs under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, I think the need for this kind of three-tiered sustainability is still there. We're still trying to balance nature protection and human benefits. And so it's, generally it's a wicked problem. There's no single best solution. But, instead, one needs to show the thorough process by which any choice is made. And by virtue of that process, we can feel good about our choice. And so part of that process, and really all major national forest planning decisions, is the requirement to involve the general public in their values. And so ideally, a river planning team needs to consider the state of the science, ranging from ecological science to economics to the social sciences more generally. And public engagement is typically kind of apart from this. And it doesn't, usually constitute rigorous social science. And so generally, there is a science bucket and a public engagement bucket. And in some ways, this approach aims to integrate the science into the public engagement process at the time when it's actually taking place. And so it's designed to be practical. We understand that decision makers and practitioners are really busy, can't take on extra work, but we really kind of promote and develop this as something that's fairly simple and readily adoptable. And so it's underpinned by a variety of social science. I won't spend any time discussing this, but I just wanted to flash it up there so you know that there's a foundation for this approach, and that foundation has been peer reviewed by the science community. And then perhaps more relevant to this crowd is that it's also been honed over several kind of different applications in different contexts. In wilderness management, forest plan revision, and as we discussed today, comprehensive river management planning. And then also, it's worth noting that it's currently being applied at the project level for a forest restoration project. So what does this protocol, what is it and what does it aim to do? And really the first goal is to understand people's human nature relationships with the natural resource. So in this case, the river. And we do this by identifying those elements or important things that are derived from some natural resource of interest. And so by elements, we could mean ecosystem services, which is fairly well-known metaphor or framework. But in the case of wild and scenic river planning, ecosystem services it didn't feel quite right. When you're thinking about social bonding or learning about tribal history, those types of things didn't feel like goods and services. And so within this context, we frame the elements as kind of human and ecological meanings and services. And while broadening that language doesn't really make a huge deal, practically speaking, I think it does make a big deal when you're communicating with the public. And once you've thought through the idea of kind of the human nature relationship and what constitutes that, you need to identify those drivers of change or the things that may be most influential. And generally, we're talking about both biophysical drivers like climate change, invasive species, fire, as well as more human-centric drivers like management actions, people's behavior, crowding. And this, once you kind of do this preliminary step of framing the planning issue, then you're relevant, or you're ready to move on to some more basic kind of implementation steps, which I'll describe. And normally I'd present the methods all the way through and then go through the results. But given the time constraints here, and that this is really about kind of trying to provide a view as to how this could be applied, I'll provide a method and then a little bit of the results. And so, how do we actually go about identifying these elements of the human nature relationship? And first, I think a brainstorming session, or just kind of, informal working with managers or other practitioners, friends groups, about the things that are meaningful to people's connection to the river in this case. That local knowledge is critical, and is really sitting there oftentimes. And so then there's often like this resource specific literature, such as the ORV descriptions in this report pictured. These documents are essentially listings of how people relate to that resource of interest. And they're also integral to the planning process. And so the goal of this method is to identify 25 to 50 benefits or relevant elements that will be sorted by the public. And they should be broadly representative of those benefits derived from, the river in this case. And so you don't want to leave out a whole ORV or something. And it's advisable to kind of spend some time pilot testing this stuff too. So you get a list of elements and have people look at it and say, oh no, you're missing this or you're missing that. And I don't have, time to fully articulate the 47 meanings and services on the Flathead, but mainly we started by distilling the report pictured here. The purpose of the act is to protect and enhance the relevant ORVs. And so the 47 benefits that we had people looking at, we wanted to really be derivative of those ORVs. And then for the drivers of change, we developed a list through, public comments, again, discussions with managers and folks on the ground, some literature review as well. And then once we had those two lists, we go about implementing this method. And how do you do that? It's fully laid out in the GTR, so I'll refer people there for the nitty-gritty details. But really, there's three primary requirements beyond some of the setup, like arts and crafts it takes to develop these boards and these decks of cards. Although we are developing an online application, which doesn't require arts and crafts. And so if you're interested in that, reach out and I can talk more on it. But really, there's three kind of components. The Q sort, which is the whiteboard here, and the white cards. And this is really when people are kind of sorting and expressing, for lack of a better term, their human nature relationship. So they're taking those 47 human and ecological meanings and services and prioritizing them from most important on the right to kind of most unimportant on the left. And it's important that the columns denote different values, but the rows don't. So you have to kind of pick your top three, most important +5, next +4, 4 for that column, 4 for the next column, and so on and so forth. And really, it's an activity that it's thought-provoking. People really do enjoy it. It's interactive. You've got these cards, you're moving them around. It's challenging because, everything's sometimes important but we're forcing people to kind of make those priorities like managers have to do. So putting them in the manager kind of hat a little bit there. And then it also forces you to interact with all these other benefits that maybe aren't first on your mind. So you might come to a public meeting or be interested in planning for 2 or 3 things, but here you're forced to kind of think about 47. So we think there's some learning benefits, as well as getting you to think about your own kind of human nature relationship a bit. And then the second component is kind of the drivers of change, which is the yellow. So you move from sorting what's important to you to kind of what's influencing that important stuff. And these yellow cards are drivers of change. And we ask people to select 5 relevant positive ones and 5 relevant negative ones out of the list of 42. And we also included a blank card. So if people had something that we missed, they could kind of write that in as well. And then the third activity is just some basic demographics to understand who's doing this. It's a purposeful or convenient sample. So we're not interested in like a random representative sample. So you just need some information to know, who's doing this. Do we have a diverse range of opinions at the table? Are we getting some groups that we know are out there that we'd like to hear from? And so that's a way to do that. And then lastly, I'll note that there is some flexibility here. You could subtract a component or add a component. You know, on the Flathead, we put in a mapping exercise to understand kind of spatial opinions. And then also did some qualitative interviews as well to understand kind of more depth and nuance around these human nature relationships. I don't talk about either of those today, but it's fully outlined in a report. And so how have we actually engaged the public with this process? You know, public meetings are great. And so you have these meetings generally on the books anyway, but what do you do with folks when they show up? And this is a good activity. You know, make sure you hear every voice in the room. So even if you're someone who doesn't have a personality to speak up, you've got this individual activity that's going to be analyzed with some scientific rigor and then reported back. But in addition to that, in the Flathead, we went out into the field and got some more folks too, who you know that not everybody's going to public meetings. You're really only getting a slice of the highly interested. So we tried to get some more diverse voices out in the field as well. And again, just to stress that it's not a representative sample. So you don't need a huge amount of people. If you were doing this with a small collaborative, say 20 or so folks involved, you know, on some planning issue, that would be adequate. So that's kind of how we get people to do it. And then what do we do with the public input once we have it, right? We had 156 folks on the Flathead do this. What do you do with those Q sorts? What do you do with the drivers of change activities? And generally it's the statistical analysis, which I won't discuss in any detail other than to say, if there's one step in this approach that I think would maybe be intimidating to folks and prevent them, it would be the stats analysis. And you know, 2 points. The first is that it's really quite basic. And if you dive into the GTR, I think anybody with even just kind of a limited stats knowledge could kind of go through the steps as we lay them out. But also, if you feel an interest in this approach, but don't want to deal with the analysis, reach out to me. There's a lot of different resources out there, and we can help line you out with some analysis. Sorry about that. And so what do you get out of the analysis? It yields a small number of different archetypes or typified perspectives, you know, that really represent that diverse range of opinions surrounding what is important, as well as those drivers of change. And so really what you would do is you get groupings of these Q sorts and people who've done it. You know, you maybe have 30 people who do it similarly, and you get this one kind of average archetype. And for those folks, you'd want them to look at that and say, yeah, that kind of looks like me. It's not exactly it, but you captured the essence pretty well. So what do these archetypes look like? Here's one from the Flathead. This is the unconfined recreation perspective. And it, you know, what we see here is you get a real detailed picture of folks who sorted like this, and this human nature relationship, you know, the recreation and leisure opportunities and activities are highly important. Certain ones, that is. Experiences with limited planning, be able to go at the drop of the hat, non-motorized river rec, dispersed camping, some of the blue ecological meanings and services supporting that, like water quality, aquatic habitat. And then some of what comes out as a little less important on the left side are motorized river rec, Native American use of the system, and some of those historic, you know, history type meanings. And then, you know, so you get these detailed understandings for all perspectives that you get out of the analysis. In this case, we had 6. But you get not only an understanding of the importance of the different meanings and services, but you also get the drivers of change knowledge. And so what do we do? Using regression analysis, we get to kind of understand, well, what drivers of change seem to be associated with the different perspectives. And so like how we interpret this is you have an increase in facilities, for example, there's a plus sign there. That means if you selected increase in facilities as your positive driver of change, or one of them, you were more likely to associate with this unconfined recreation perspective. On the flip side, if you had a negative view of permit system and you selected that as a negative drive, you were much more likely, the triple plus means it is a pretty big coefficient, you are much more likely to associate with this unconfined recreation perspective. And then on the flip side, like negative means you are less likely. So if you were honing in on biophysical impacts and invasive weeds is something that concerns you, you were less likely to kind of align with this rec perspective. And so I'll just kind of move on to the more comparison. And I know this slide's a bit much, but hang with me. This slide shows the 6 archetypes identified and explored in the Flathead study. And as you can see, each archetype is named. While simplified, the name can help to, you know, generally articulate those elements of the human nature relationship that are most important to each archetype. For instance, the indigenous worldview is named for its, the high level of importance assigned to Native American use of the river system and the history and knowledge as well. And then, the full report outlines all of these in detail and interpretation, and we layer in some qualitative data as well. But, just looking at this kind of comparison with only a few of the human and ecological meanings populated, it's possible, to see where there's potential consensus, such as around water quality and aquatic habitat, as well as variation, such as around guided recreation, right? Guided recreation was seen as kind of important to some, unimportant to others. And so that as a decision maker, as a practitioner, that this is an issue that's going to maybe polarize or be perceived differently depending on who you talk to. And so I need to move on and wrap up, but these archetypes, and associated drivers of change, you'd spend a lot of time with these. You'd really think about them, perhaps most importantly, communicate them to the public so that people can understand perspectives other than their own. And in the general report and the technical report, we make two kind of main management implication arguments: decision making and public relations. And over time, the importance of this work for public relations has really become more clear. As I noted at the outset, planning and management decisions are often within the context of a wicked problem. There's no single correct answer. It's a process about kind of consideration of different human nature relationships and clear communication of the connections that people have. And so even if you're upset about a decision, the idea, because it doesn't align with how you feel, the hope is that you understand where that decision comes from. You can see these other relationships out there. Oh, okay, they're considering this one or that one. I don't really like it, but I understand it. And that goes for both managers and planners to understand the public, but also for the public to understand each other. And then in terms of decision making, an understanding of the diverse range of perspectives and related to the ecological meanings as well as the drivers can maybe help articulate broad management approaches in a plan, potentially define different alternatives, or maybe even add some detail to the record of decision. But having said all that, I know that these implications, kind of is an open question, and it's a question I'm always interested in talking about. And so as I hear new ideas, that's very helpful. They're always welcome. And as I continue to understand the challenges facing folks on the ground, I think these implications can become more clear and maybe more specific. And so with that, I'll open it up to questions, and thank you so much for your time.